Working Cows Podcast, Episode 37.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Hey everybody, it's Clay Connery, your host of the Working Cows Podcast, here with another episode. Before we get started on that, I got a couple of housekeeping items. If I sound a little sweeter today, it's because another one of my generous listeners went ahead and ordered me something off of the Amazon wish list. I very much appreciate that. Thank you so much for the support that I have received thus far. There are still some items up there if you want to support the show in that way. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. The second piece of housekeeping is that I've kind of been teasing a couple of exciting announcements, and I'm going to tease you for a little bit longer because I think I should be able to share the video that will contain the announcement for, or this first of the two exciting announcements. I should be able to share that video next week. So I want you to be on the lookout for that, and we will get those out to you and get you made aware of kind of some of the exciting developments around here with the Working Cows Podcast. On to the purpose of the episode. Today, my guest is Lyle Perman. Lyle is a fourth-generation rancher near central South Dakota, and he's got a great story to tell about how they have come to change their management style and also how they are planning to pass on that management to the next generation. So I want to encourage you to check out the show notes page for this episode, workingcows.net/37, workingcows.net/37. You can find that show notes page. There will be a couple of slides there from Lyle. One of them with their mission statement and the other one with their ranch goal. So I'll just share with you their mission statement for now. Our mission is to reflect Christ in how we love people, manage the land, and care for its inhabitants, both domestic and wild. Kind of one of those really great holistic goals and holistic missions that we so appreciate here at the Working Cows Podcast. So I'm really excited for you to hear this interview with Lyle Perman. We get into some talk about management succession, and it turns out to be a really great time. So without any further ado, here is Lyle Perman of Lowry, South Dakota. Lyle, thanks for joining me on the Working Cows Podcast. I appreciate you taking the time out on the road to sit down with me. I would just like to start off with a little bit of the history of the operation that you're a part of and kind of how you came to be doing what it is you're doing now.
Well, I guess I grew up, I didn't know any better. I thought that's what I was supposed to do. So I was fourth generation in our family to ranch in the Lowry area, and I guess I never had much of a thought of doing anything else other than coming back to the ranch.
And where were you coming back to the ranch from when you came back?
Well, I grew up east of the town of Lowry, about 5 miles, and in 1975, my dad bought this ranch northwest of Lowry, and then Garnet and I got married in 1976, graduated from college in 1977, from South Dakota State University, and then came back and started ranching at that time. 4 sets of great-grandparents that homesteaded in the area, so I guess ended up not going too far.
And what was the history of the operation when you did come back to the? What were some of the?
Well, the place that my dad bought was a dairy, 960 acres, some of which was tillable ground, and we planted that all back to grass, and have expanded it since then. Garnet and I have, and but the history was a dairy farm, and And anyway, we converted it all over to a cow-calf yearling operation.
And was your dad the one that kind of was involved in planting it back to grass, or were there still some tillage going on when you were younger?
On the 960 acres, my dad had the foresight to plant it back right away to grass and alfalfa. Most of it. Some of it Garnet and I did then in the earlier years in our business, but for the most part, our ranch for the last 40 years, as we acquire more land, anything that's marginal, we just put back to grass and alfalfa and would hay it. In some of the more recent years, we've planted a more diverse mix of grasses and forbs and used managed grazing on it. We do have some tillable ground, but it's only our very best soils that we keep in a crop rotation.
Sure. And what are some of the crops that you're raising on that tillable ground?
Well, I'm going to have a disclaimer right away. I rent it out to my son Luke, so I'm going to tell you what crops he raises on that ground. And some of it he's got in cover crops that he's grazing, custom grazing cattle on. He'll raise corn, soybeans, wheat, field peas. So those are his primary cash crops that he raises on there.
Sure. And that's an interesting family dynamic there. I don't know that it just proves, I guess, that the it's a cattle business that you guys are running. The fact that you're renting that ground to your son, how does that work out? How did that come to be the case that he's renting ground from you?
Well, I guess it was Garnet and my ultimate goal, to work on transition and make sure that the next generation is successful and properly equipped to operate a business. And that's something you start when they're young. When I say young, our daughter Tyson, our son Luke, started with a few chickens and a few sheep, and that's when the business training started. And it grew into cattle, and then, of course, when Luke graduated from college and got married, things just take place at a larger scale in terms of cattle numbers. But the transition of the business itself and knowledge on how to operate it probably started when they're little kids, and it's just a natural progression to where Luke is right now, renting everything from Garnet and I, from tractors and haying machines to the cattle and the land. And then Garnet and I just work for nothing.
And how's that process going as far as the transition is concerned?
Well, the working for nothing is working really well for Luke.
And
because
go ahead.
Because he doesn't have to write us a check. We give him, I shouldn't say that. We give him a choice of paying us in cash or in livestock, and we want some earned income, so we do get paid for our work. But the equipment we rent by the hour or by the acre. The cattle we rent on a share basis, and then the land, the grazing land by the AUM, and the tillable ground, or crop ground, I should say, because we don't use any tillage. The crop land by the acre.
Sure. And this transition process is really interesting to me, and the way that you guys are going about it. If we can camp out there for a little bit longer, I think that's a good nugget
Sure.
to mine.
Fine.
How did that process? You got started when he was very young, and he expressed an interest. So when you talk about renting these things to him, is the goal more to transition the management of these assets, and then at some point in the future, the assets would transfer along with the management? Is that how this is going?
Sure. Yep, that's exactly how it is. You know, we're right now, Garnet and I are traveling to a nephew's wedding, and if we don't make it home, we are very comfortable with the fact that Luke and Naomi are fully equipped to operate the ranch without us. And so that's been our goal, and that transition started, the management transition started shortly after Luke graduated from college and got married. And so now we're at least 10 years into that, and he's fully capable of making all the decisions that need to be made on the ranch on a day-to-day basis. And he's been real good about asking me what I think, and you know, this gives him some flexibility also to try some new things. As far as the ownerships are concerned, the case of the cows, he brings replacement heifers into the business, and of course we've expanded some additional rented ground and in some cases some additional deeded ground. So the number of cattle that I actually own and he leases or operates on a share haven't really declined. His numbers are going up, but I still own about the same number just because of expansion. As far as equipment is concerned, you know, the idea is if a new piece of equipment needs to be purchased, that's an expense that he'll need to incur. And so the day will come when I probably might still own a tractor or, you know, something like that. My ranch pickup, the one that I always use. But for the most part, the equipment is something that Luke will gradually replace, and then he'll own.
And where did this strategy of management transition come from? What was the genesis of that idea?
Well, to start with, the motivation was to accomplish exactly what we wanted: ownership on the operation of the business on his part, and you know what's the best way of doing it. And I guess if you go to enough meetings and listen to enough people, you can pick up bits and pieces of what might or might not work just by hearing experiences from others. So I guess I'm not going to put my finger on one particular book or workshop or seminar I attended, but just what you pick up from just attending and listening to other people.
And how would you say that it differs from other strategies you've seen?
Well, I think one of the problems in agriculture in particular is not everybody has our situation. So I'll have a disclaimer out there by saying that. But the problem is with my generation and those that are older than I is our unwillingness to relinquish control, and that's the first thing you've got to have a mindset about doing, and have an interest in making sure that the next generation is successful. I've seen too many arrangements where dad is still trying to increase his net worth at times at the expense of his own family. And I think that that's unfortunate. And then they get to be a certain age and they've got this huge estate and they're trying to figure out how to transfer it. Well, if they'd have started maybe 10 or 20 years sooner, it might have been a little easier. So I guess I'm not going to say I'm going to be broke when I die because it depends on how long I live. But my goal is when I reach that point in time that our assets are pretty well diminished to our children, both Kaiser and Luke, and that, of course, makes the transition easier.
And how does your daughter figure into that equation as far as the transition is concerned?
Well, of course, she's not on the ranch, and so we've made it clear that if you're interested in being a part of the ranch and in ownership in the ranch, then you better be there to help. And so one of the rules that we have, if you want to run cows on Rock Hills Ranch, then you better show up to help during calving, during haying, when we process them. And so it wasn't an easy thing for me to buy out our daughters. She didn't have that many cattle anyway, but when she was in college, she'd made the decision she wasn't coming back. And it was, we both cried when I had to write a check for the last cow she owned because she knew that she couldn't keep it. So that's how it works on the ranch. Now, as far as how do we treat our daughter and our son, we just have two children fairly. They both understand it's not going to be equal. We try and and make sure that the assets that our daughter ends up with are not ones that Luke will need to operate the ranch on a day-to-day basis. So she'll end up getting some land, and it's land that Luke rents right now, but from Garnet and I. But for the most part, the major real estate assets Luke and Naomi will end up with. And again, the livestock and the equipment, he is gradually increasing the percentage that he owns by replacing cows that I've got and the equipment that Garnet and I've got.
What I am hearing very clearly from you is that there was a very intentional process of conversations, not just assumptions. Is that accurate as far as this process?
Absolutely. I grew up at a time where when these kind of conversations took place with my father in particular, it was something that he was very uncomfortable talking about, and if I try and bring the subject up, he would avoid answering any questions or engaging in any type of discussion. And I didn't want to make that I'm going to call it same mistake. And so Garnet and I have been very open with Chris and Kaisa and Luke and Naomi about our intentions.
That's a really encouraging history, and I think that's something that we need a lot more of in the industry. There's way too many things that are just assumed, and we have to be more clear about the future and talk about it, very clearly.
Absolutely.
What else is happening as far as the transition is concerned? Are there any other pieces there that we could talk about, or anything else that goes into that process for you guys?
I can't really put my finger on any one particular thing. Just regular communication I think is important. And Luke, I pretty well turned that over to Luke, and he'll have, I would guess their quarterly meetings. Our intention were to have meetings once a month, but we get so busy that sometimes it's hard to find the time in some months to sit down. But I would say we have quarterly ranch meetings where we talk about things like this if need be. And so I guess the bottom line that I would tell families is you need, and it shouldn't be the next generation that's on the ranch or on the farm that initiate these conversations. The parents are the ones that need to initiate the conversation and need to be very clear about their intentions. Because at the end of the day, I want to make sure that my children and my grandchildren are still talking with each other. Because a lot of times, if you want to see the families made up, give them $1 to divide. And when mom and dad are gone, and unfortunately, the assets that a family accumulates end up dividing families. And I've seen it happen all too often. And that's the thing that we want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. These quarterly ranch meetings, they're a part of your transition process, and they are helping you guys to stay on the same page. That intentional communication is a huge part of it, and I just really appreciate that. Appreciate the perspective. It's so helpful and necessary. And I also appreciate, you making the point about your generation or the older generation needing to be the one that initiates the conversation. And that's a big one that I think is very helpful.
We also have a ranch mission and a ranch goal. And I don't have them memorized for this podcast, but I'll be happy to send them to you. And if you want to share them with your listeners to this podcast, you most certainly can.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. I appreciate that. I guess when this whole episode was kind of facilitated by Luke. He reached out to me through my website, workingcows.net, and we exchanged some emails, and I asked him if he would be interested in being a guest, and he he said, no, my dad would be better for that. And, that's kind of the response I get from all the ranchers is, somebody else, there's somebody else out there that you could talk to. But I appreciate you taking the time. And one of the things that piqued my interest in the Rock Hills Ranch was seeing that you guys were the 2014 recipients of the Leopold Award. What was that? What brought that about in your mind as far as things that you guys are doing on the ranch?
Well, I would say that there's many people that on the land may do things that are similar to what we're doing, but there's that old saying, it takes a village, and I think that really is true because our family is very engaged not just in the production end of the business, but Luke is involved in the Beef SD program first as a participant and then as a mentor. Garnet as a writer. He writes a column called On the 100th Meridian. Has written that for various publications for over 10 years. Plus, she writes for the South Dakota Grassland Coalition, a feature story, usually 9 or 10 of those a year. I do public speaking and am involved in various organizations trying to keep the prairies right side up. And so those are just some of the things that we participate in. This past June, so the past 30 days, you might say, we've hosted a mineral workshop at our ranch. We've hosted the Beef SD group for a meeting and a tour on our ranch. We've hosted a 4-H group of pasture walk plant identification on our ranch. We've hosted, spoke at the Grass-Fed Exchange on our ranch, had the South Dakota Bird Tour on our ranch, and that's in the last 30 days. And so it was a busy June. And so anyway, a lot going on, and before the end of the year, we're going to host 2 corporate groups, one of them just for an evening and the next day, so basically for 24 hours. And then the other ones will be there for about 48 hours, 2 nights. And so one evening, one full day, and then the next morning. And these would be, when I say corporate, we're talking Costco, McDonald's, Walmart, Culver's, people that are involved in food production from their corporate offices, giving them an idea of what regenerative agriculture looks like.
That's cool.
So those are that just gives you a little glimpse into some of the things that our family's involved in.
Yeah, very cool.
My number one goal, though, is to make sure that the next generation, which would be Luke, has a good handle on what sustainable regenerative agriculture looks like, and hopefully I'll live long enough that I can teach my grandchildren the same concept.
And where did those sustainable and regenerative agricultural thoughts come into your view?
Well, I think Garnet and I have always been lifelong learners, and so it wasn't something we necessarily picked up in college, because the whole idea of regenerative agriculture is something that's relatively new. But the more you learn about the ecosystem that you're a part of, the more you understand how you can impact it either in a positive or negative way. So as we continue to learn, this thought process just has evolved. And so I guess, our goal is along that line, is to learn something new about the ecosystem we live in every year. And I can say, we normally do it. It might be learning to identify sound of a bird in terms of what bird is that, or it might be learning to identify a new plant, or maybe a reptile, or maybe, something about water, something about infiltration. So it's just a lifelong goal of ours to continue to learn.
Very good. I appreciate that perspective. So many of the things that we've talked about here today are right in the wheelhouse of what we're trying to do here at the Working Cows Podcast. The sustainability of every ranch depends on its ability to be transitioned in its management to a future generation, and so much of that transition process is dependent upon being profitable, and sustainability is not just ecologic, but it's also economic. And so there's so many of those things that go into it, because many times in the ranching industry, the reason the next generation doesn't want to come back is because it's not a lot of fun. And the reason it sometimes, or many times, the reason it's not a lot of fun is because it's not very profitable.
That's exactly right. And I guess the thing that I would challenge your listeners to, that are a part of my generation, that have really done a good job of creating a ranch or a farm that's profitable, and they're doing a good job on the land. Your next goal needs to make sure that what you've done and what you've learned, that you transition to the next generation. I guess I would challenge your listeners to that.
For sure. No, I appreciate that. If we want to see these landscapes maintained, if we want to see this grass stay right side up, as you said, the management transition is going to be the most important part, and kind of everything that we've talked about today goes into that you've got to be sustainable economically and ecologically before the management transition makes any difference at all. So appreciate your perspective and your time today. Are there any resources that you would like to make people aware of? If I was going to make a show notes page at workingcows.net/37, people could go there and check it out. Is there any resources that you'd like to make them aware of?
Well, I guess I would direct them to any functions that the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition and the South Dakota Grassland Coalition sponsors. They probably have been two of the resources that I've learned the most from about management. And I guess maybe I'm a little bit partial because I've been on the board of directors of the Grassland Coalition in the past. But generally speaking, if they sponsor something, it's more than likely worthwhile going to. So encourage your listeners to attend one of their events. And one of the first ones is one that I'm in charge of, and that's the Happy Cow Tour coming up July 27th, which is a Friday, in the Mobridge area. Go online and look it up.
Yep, and we'll put links to all that. Lyle and I actually met at a South Dakota Grassland Coalition event. We met face-to-face at the award presentation for the Leopold Award to the Kamak family, who have been supporters of this show since its inception. So, and I agree with that. That event was very much worth going to, and it proves that Lyle puts his money where his mouth is when he says that he goes to continuing education events and is committed to being a lifelong learner. So I appreciate your perspective today, Lyle, and taking the time to sit down and share that with me. Thank you.
Well, it's been an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just some very helpful stuff there with Lyle. I really appreciate him taking the opportunity to sit down with me and talk a little bit about their plans for passing on management, which is so important. Is that we pass on management, not just assets, but we pass on management styles so that those sustainable practices continue on into the future, and the return on investment with those sustainable practices continues to grow and grow and grow. Coming up next week, we've got a great discussion about AIing, artificial insemination, with a very well-rounded individual. So I encourage you to come back next week for that discussion on episode 38 of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.